The Mafia boss pulled me out of the sea when I was about to drown. He dragged me from the water and threw me onto the cold, wet wooden floor like tossing aside a prey, still gasping for breath. "If you weren't Giovanni Moretti's daughter," he said, voice hoarse and cruel, "I would have let you die." I laughed, though my lips still tasted of blood. "I don't need the pity of a murderer." He looked at me, those dark eyes glinting with something both cold and wounded. "Someday you'll know who the real killer is." He turned away, leaving behind the scent of gunpowder and smoke hanging in the wooden room. Before crossing the doorway, he murmured like a curse, "One day, I'll come back for what's mine. I am Elena Moretti, the only daughter of the man he once swore to destroy." The air in my lungs felt thick and heavy, like I was breathing silt instead of wind, and every cough shook a brutal pain through my ribs. Where the waves had hammered me against the hull of the sinking yacht, my father's precious toy now just splinters and smoke out on the dark water. I lay there feeling the grit of salt and desperation clinging to my skin, vaguely aware of the sound of the ocean outside, a relentless churning roar that had just tried to swallow me whole, and the sound of heavy measured breathing nearby, the breathing of the man who had inexplicably chosen not to let the sea finish the job. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, trying to steady the world that was spinning violently around me, and when I finally managed to lift my head, I saw him standing over me. Damian Rossi, the ghost from my father's past, the man who was supposed to be rotting in some Italian prison or worse. The flickering lamplight caught the sharp, almost cruel angles of his face, and his clothes were dark and heavy with seawater. But the coldness in his eyes was absolute, a chilling certainty that didn't belong on a man who had just risked his life in a hostile sea. "If you weren't Giovanni Moretti's daughter," he said, voice hoarse and cruel, the sound scratching against the stillness of the small derelict room, "I would have let you die." He didn't offer a towel or a blanket, or even a look of basic human decency, just the harsh statement delivered with a kind of profound resentment that made my own blood feel cold in my veins. The implication was clear: I was alive only because I carried the name of the man who had ruined his life, not because I held any inherent value as a person. His hostility, the sheer unbridled hatred simmering just beneath the surface of his controlled voice, was like a slap across the face, even more stinging than the salt burn on my skin. I laughed, a harsh, ragged sound that felt dry and foreign, though my lips still tasted sharply of blood from biting down too hard during the struggle in the waves, and I pushed myself to sit fully upright, ignoring the searing pain in my side, refusing to show him even an inch of weakness or fear. "I don't need the pity of a murderer." My voice was just a raw whisper, but I poured every ounce of defiance and contempt I had left into those words, watching to see if I could make him flinch, if I could penetrate that terrifying wall of control he had built around himself. It was a stupid, reckless thing to say to a man who had just saved your life, and could just as easily end it now in this remote shack with no one to know or care. But I was so furious at the casual cruelty, at the way he reduced my existence to nothing more than a bargaining chip, that I couldn't hold the words back. The air was thick with the smell of wet wood, old fishing nets, and the metallic tang of gunpowder that clung to his dark coat, a testament to the brutal fight that had taken place just hours before. And I knew without being told that he was the one responsible for the attack, for the wreckage of my life that lay scattered across the coastline. He looked at me, then truly looked at me, and those dark eyes glinting with something both cold and wounded, an expression so complex and fleeting that I almost misted a shadow of deep, enduring pain that contradicted the hard line of his jaw and the ruthlessness in his stance. For a fleeting second, the terrifying mob boss dissolved, and I saw only a man who had suffered an unimaginable loss. A man driven by something far deeper and darker than simple greed or power. And the sudden glimpse of his humanity almost made me retract my sharp words. But the moment passed too quickly. He simply tilted his head, a dismissive gesture that conveyed everything he thought of my accusation. And me, a gesture that reminded me exactly where I stood, a captive, a pawn completely at his mercy, and the full weight of my desperate situation settled in my stomach like a stone. "Someday, you'll know who the real killer is." He turned away, the movement fluid and silent, despite his imposing height, the action final, and absolute, leaving behind only the scent of gunpowder and smoke hanging in the wooden room, a lingering, choking reminder of the night's violence. I watched his broad back as he moved toward the one splintered wooden door, the only way out of this cold, damp prison. And I wanted to scream at him to come back, to demand answers, to tear down the wall of lies that had defined my entire life up until this moment. But the words caught in my throat, replaced by a terrible realization. He wasn't going to offer me clarity or comfort. He was just going to leave me here to rot, physically saved but emotionally abandoned, stuck in this terrifying limbo between life and death. Between the father who controlled me and the enemy who now owned my survival. Before crossing the doorway, he paused, his hand gripping the rotting frame, and he murmured like a curse whispered into the wind, low enough that I barely caught it over the continuous steady roar of the crashing waves outside. One day, I'll come back for what's mine. The words weren't a threat of violence, not exactly. They were a chilling prophecy, a claim staked on my future, a promise that he wasn't finished with me or the Moretti family, and the way he said mine made my skin crawl, implying ownership over something far more valuable than revenge or power, something personal. I am Elena Moretti, 26 years old, the only daughter of the man he once swore to destroy, a girl who had always been sheltered, always guarded, always considered too precious to touch. And now I was nothing more than a salvaged piece of wreckage claimed by the one person in the world who should have let me sink. The cold realization of my new reality was profound, sinking deeper than the sea I had just been pulled from, forcing me to finally understand that my life was no longer my own, if it ever truly had been. It's hard to tell a story like this, because it's not really the kind of thing you just casually drop into conversation over coffee, the kind of story that starts with, "So a mafia boss saved me from drowning, but then he claimed me as collateral." That first night, the way he just left me alone in that shack, shivering under a moldy blanket he had tossed onto the floor beside me without ever meeting my eyes, felt like the cruelest kind of kindness, a terrible, agonizing limbo, where I didn't know if the sun would ever rise, or if I was going to be dragged out and killed before morning. I think maybe if you've ever felt completely unseen, like your life is just background noise to someone else's much louder, more important drama, then you might understand that particular brand of helplessness that wrapped around me like the cold sea air. I was the golden cage daughter, always polite, always quiet, always standing just a little bit behind my father, and I had accepted that my role was to be beautiful and silent, to be the symbol of his untouchable power, never realizing that being a symbol meant you weren't really human, just an object waiting to be traded, or in this case, salvaged. That terrifying cold exchange with Damien, where he saw me only as Moretti's daughter, was the first time I felt the weight of my identity as something truly dangerous, something that could get me killed, but also something that now inexplicably had him invested in my survival. Hey, I'm just gonna take a quick pause right here because I know that feeling when a story just hits you in the gut when you realize you've been underestimated or judged by the size of your world, or what your name means to other people. If this is connecting with you, if you know what it's like to walk through fire with your dignity intact, please just take a second. Right now, open up your phone and hit that like button on the video. It helps other people who might need to hear this story find it, And if you have a moment, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And of course, if you want to walk with me through the rest of this journey, through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing, please make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thank you. It really means the world to me. Okay, let's get back to it. I was back in my father's compound before noon the next day, not carried in triumph, but delivered like a package dropped off at the gates by a silent man in a black car, who simply confirmed my identity to the frantic guards and drove away without another word, leaving me standing there alone on the smooth, polished marble driveway, looking utterly out of place in my borrowed, oversized, and slightly salty clothes. My father Giovanni rushed out and embraced me with a violence that felt more like confirming ownership than expressing relief. His voice booming and full of false emotion, but I could feel the tension radiating off him, the way his hands gripped my arms, not with paternal affection, but with the desperate fear of a man who had lost and then unexpectedly regained a priceless asset. The moment he realized I was physically fine, the relief in his eyes was replaced by a calculating cold fury, the kind of look that made it clear the real damage was to his reputation, to the myth of his impregnability. And he immediately demanded to know every detail about Damien, about the shack, about the things we had spoken of. His eyes narrowed with suspicion, already trying to figure out how to spin this disaster to his advantage. Damien himself showed up 3 days later, not sneaking in, but arriving with a blatant, arrogant disregard for my father's authority. His sleek black car pulling right up to the front entrance in broad daylight, a clear declaration of war that sent a shockwave through the entire fortress of security. My father met him in the main reception hall, the room where we usually entertained foreign dignitaries and heads of other families, a space designed for opulence and intimidation. But Damien looked completely unimpressed by the soaring ceilings and the Renaissance art standing utterly still in the center of the room, radiating a quiet, deadly confidence that dwarfed even my formidable father. The two of them stood maybe 5 feet apart, two immovable forces, and the silence in that enormous room was so profound, it felt like the floorboards might crack under the unbearable pressure of their unspoken mutual hatred. It was like watching two predators circle each other, one old and established, the other lean and hungry, and I stood off to the side near the tall French doors, feeling the air crackle with their history, like watching a memory being played out for the 3rd time. When Damien spoke, his voice was low and steady, not raised, not threatening, just stating a fact of the world, and he made it clear he wasn't there to demand ransom or make a grand show, but simply to settle a specific agonizing score. And the tension in the room ratcheted up so high I could barely breathe. He told my father that he was returning me the collateral, and that the debt wasn't cleared, only deferred, a deliberate insult that cut my father to the quick, making his face darken with fury. Then just as he was turning to leave, repeating that terrible promise for all the heavily armed guards and my father's lieutenants to hear, "One day I'll come back for what's mine," something happened that felt like a trick of the light. A small, involuntary movement that changed everything I thought I knew. A worn, faded photograph slipped from the inner pocket of his coat, fluttering down to the polished marble floor between them. A moment so small it shouldn't have mattered, yet the sight of it stopped both men cold in their tracks, and I found myself walking forward, drawn by an invisible, powerful thread, needing to see the secret that had fallen out of his heart. I picked up the photo, my fingers brushing the smooth, slightly curled edges, and I saw a woman smiling up at the camera. A young, vibrant version of my mother, and standing right beside her with his arm draped casually around her shoulders, was a man I instantly recognized as the older, wiser mirror image of Damien Rossi himself, his father, the man my father had supposedly betrayed and eliminated years ago, the man whose ruin was the foundation of the Moretti Empire. The moment I saw the tenderness in my mother's eyes, the way she was leaning into the other man, my whole body went numb, and I felt the solid ground beneath my feet begin to shift, realizing the simple, terrifying implication. The hatred between these two men wasn't just about territory or money. It was woven into the very fabric of my family, rooted in a betrayal that went deeper than I could have ever imagined. My hand began to tremble, and I clutched the photograph like a fragile clue, refusing to let it drop. Because in that instant, the cool, calculating mob boss standing before me suddenly looked vulnerable. His eyes fixed on the photo, radiating an unbearable mixture of grief and love, and I knew instinctively that the pain I had seen in his eyes by the sea had been real, a reflection of a life stolen, not just a vendetta manufactured by greed. My father snatched the photograph from my hand, his face pale and contorted, his initial rage giving way to a sickening, panicked dread. And he crumpled the image in his fist, shouting, "Get out! Get out of my house!" Rossi, his voice cracking with a fear I had never heard before. A fear that told me the simple photo was the key to a truth he had spent decades burying. Damien didn't react to the yelling. He simply held my gaze for a long, heavy moment, a look that conveyed apology pain and a grim determination all at once. And then he turned and walked out, leaving behind a silence far more profound than the one he had broken. It took me weeks of sneaking through old photo albums, cross-referencing names and bribing elderly servants before I finally pieced together the impossible truth. Before my mother had married Giovanni Moretti, before I was born, she had been deeply in love with Damien's father, a connection broken only by my father's ruthless ambition and cold-blooded machinations. Meaning I was not just the daughter of the victor, but the living, breathing evidence of the loser's ruin, the symbol of the broken promise that tied these two deadly families together. Damien vanished after that confrontation, disappearing back into the shadows of the criminal underworld, leaving behind not just a crack in the foundation of my father's seemingly impenetrable mafia world, but also a fissure right down the center of my own heart, which had been so carefully shielded and contained for 26 years. Every interaction I had ever witnessed between my parents, every strained silence and forced smile every time my father had looked at me with a calculating, possessive pride now took on a sinister new meaning, replaying in my mind as a series of lies, and the weight of that deception became a constant physical pressure behind my eyes. I started seeing everything differently. The guards were not protection, but jailers. The expensive silks I wore were not clothes, but a uniform. The world I inhabited was not a palace, but an elaborate stage set for a tragedy that was already well underway. And the only person who had ever shown me the raw, unfiltered truth, however cruel, was the man who had pulled me from the waves. A year passed, a period of suffocating stillness after the violence and the revelations, and my father's need to solidify his position, which had been dangerously exposed by the attack, and Damien's audacity became acute and immediate. That's when the discussion started about Nico Varga, a prominent and highly feared international arms dealer, whose influence extended far beyond the traditional territories of the Italian and French families, a man whose alliance was considered crucial, if not absolutely necessary for my father's continued survival. I overheard the hushed, urgent phone calls, the detailed discussions about territories and shipping routes, about the strategic advantage this union would provide. And it didn't take a genius to figure out my role in this calculated power play. I was the bridge, the guarantee, the beautiful, well-educated, and quietly compliant daughter, and I understood with a dull, aching certainty that I was nothing more than an extremely valuable commodity being packaged for trade, a human contract meant to seal a deadly business deal. Nico Varga himself was everything Damien wasn't: polished, impeccably dressed, charming to the point of being unsettling, and utterly devoid of anything resembling genuine human emotion. He looked at me not with affection or desire, but with a cold, appreciative assessment, the way a collector might examine a rare piece of art he was about to acquire, running his eyes over my clothes, my demeanor, and my quiet compliance. He was older, maybe 42, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, and the conversations we had were all surface-level banalities, carefully scripted exchanges about art, travel, and the political climate, never once touching on anything real, anything personal. Confirming my darkest fears, I was not marrying a man. I was being integrated into a business transaction, and my life, my autonomy. My very self was the collateral being put forward to keep my father's crumbling empire from falling completely apart. The wedding date was set, the engagement party planned to be the most lavish public display of power my father had ever organized, meant to silence all the rumors and firmly establish the new, unshakable alliance. And I felt like I was being prepared for a sacrifice, dressing myself in the designer white silk dress, the symbol of purity and commitment that felt like the most profound lie I had ever told. The engagement party was a dazzling, suffocating spectacle, held in the main ballroom of our estate. A sea of black ties, glittering diamonds, and whispered malicious gossip, with every influential and dangerous figure from the coastal territories in attendance, all of them watching me. The quiet daughter who was about to secure her father's reign by marrying a notorious arms dealer. I stood beside Nico, forcing a small, serene smile onto my lips. the massive diamond on my finger feeling cold and heavy like a shackle, nodding politely to the endless stream of congratulations that felt more like congratulations for my father's success than for my happiness. And every face I looked at was a mask of calculated insincerity. People who measured worth purely by wealth status, and the cruelty they could inflict without consequence. I caught the eye of Lucien, my longtime personal guard, a man whose loyalty to me had always felt complicated and intense. And in his usually guarded eyes, I saw a flicker of genuine anguish, a silent confirmation that he knew exactly how much of a pawn I was, that he was utterly powerless to stop the proceedings, and the sight of his pain was the only thing that threatened to break my carefully constructed composure. It was exactly at the moment my father raised his champagne flute, preparing to give his toast a flowery, self-congratulatory speech, meant to cement the Varga Moretti alliance, and announce the date for the wedding, that the heavy ballroom doors burst open, not with a ceremonial flourish, but with a violent, terrifying crash, followed instantly by the sharp, familiar sound of gunfire outside the room. The sudden, absolute silence in the ballroom was more frightening than the chaos. All the hundreds of powerful guests frozen mid-sip, mid-whisper, their faces shifting instantly from polished arrogance to pure animalistic terror. And I watched as the sleek, dark figure of Damien Rossi strode into the room seemingly unharmed and utterly unafraid, moving through the terrified crowd with the effortless grace of a true predator. He was flanked by two heavily armed men, but his own presence was the most lethal weapon in the room, drawing every eye, silencing every thought, and the flashing light of the cameras meant to capture the happiness of the engagement now illuminated his fierce, uncompromising face as he walked straight towards the center of the room toward me. He stopped directly in front of Nico, who had gone pale with shock, and his eyes, dark and heavy like storm clouds, bypassed the arms dealer, completely locking onto mine for a terrifying moment, before he turned his attention to the sputtering, infuriated man who was my father. The sheer audacity of his appearance was staggering. It wasn't just an attack. It was a profound public humiliation designed to dismantle my father's power piece by calculated piece. And the way he looked at me conveyed a complete dismissal of the entire event, as if the party, the guests, and the engagement were all just an inconvenient backdrop to the real deadly drama. Then, in a voice that cut through the silence like a razor wire, loud enough for every horrified, transfixed person in the vast ballroom to hear, he delivered the chilling promise. But this time it was a statement of intent, a declaration of war. I came back for what's mine. My father, Giovanni. His face purple with outrage and fear, finally found his voice and roared his command, echoing uselessly against the sudden shift in power. She is my daughter. She belongs here. Damien finally turned to face my father completely, a slow, deliberate movement that was heavy with menace. And the ghost of a smile, cold and knowing, touched the corners of his mouth as he dismissed the raging man standing before him. No. Damien responded, his tone flat and unyielding, the ultimate statement of authority that reduced my father's bluster to pathetic noise. She is the debt that you still haven't paid. In that single moment, standing there in my white silk dress with the diamond on my finger and the sound of distant gunshots still ringing in my ears, I understood that I was not just a pawn in the game between two families, but the living, breathing, inescapable focal point of a decade-long tragedy, the currency that would finally settle a balance sheet written in blood and broken hearts. Damien didn't wait for a response. He simply took my arm, not roughly, but with a firm, possessive grip, and began walking toward the shattered doors, pulling me away from the ruins of the party, past the frozen, terrified faces of the guests. And I made no resistance because deep down beneath the fear and the confusion, there was a terrible sense of inevitability, a bizarre, dark relief that the elaborate lie of my life had finally and violently collapsed. Damien took me not in a desperate flight, but with the quiet confidence of a man reclaiming lost property, leading me to a heavily guarded, isolated estate, perched on a cliff overlooking the same restless sea that had almost claimed me a year prior. A house that felt less like a prison and more like a mausoleum of beautiful, dark secrets. He didn't lock me in a basement or keep me in a small, damp shack this time. He installed me in the master suite, a space filled with cool marble and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning but terrifying view of the limitless ocean. And he assigned 2 silent, watchful women to attend to my every need, which meant they were there to monitor my every move. The entire situation was bizarre, completely overturning my expectations of a vengeful mafia boss. He hadn't killed me, hadn't hurt me, hadn't even interrogated me, but had simply taken me out of one gilded cage and placed me into another equally luxurious one. And the ambiguity of his motives was slowly driving me mad with anxiety and suspicion. It was during the 3rd week of this unsettling captivity that he finally came to me with something tangible. Something that proved this was not just a game of power or revenge, but a far deeper and more complex operation. He entered the room without knocking, holding a pristine white envelope in his hand, and the way he held it with a reverence that seemed completely out of character for such a ruthless man told me that whatever was inside was the true core of his mission. He didn't speak. He just laid the envelope on the mahogany desk, pushed it toward me with the tip of one long, controlled finger, and then stepped back to lean against the wall, crossing his arms over his chest, his expression unreadable, waiting for me to engage with the secret he had just delivered. I approached the desk with a profound sense of dread, my hand trembling slightly as I picked up the envelope, the sterile white paper feeling heavy and cold in my palm. And the moment I pulled out the papers and saw the official letterhead, a legitimate DNA testing facility from Switzerland, the air left my lungs, completely forcing me to grasp the edge of the desk for support. The test results were meticulously detailed, clinical, and devastatingly simple, showing a clear, unambiguous lack of biological connection between myself and Giovanni Moretti, the man I had called father for 26 years, the man who had supposedly raised me, guarded me, and owned me, and the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, leaving me gasping for air as the lie of my entire existence finally came crashing down. My mind spun, trying to reconcile the meticulously constructed narrative of my life with the cold scientific facts of the document, and I looked up at Damien expecting to see triumph or mockery in his eyes, convinced this was the ultimate psychological torture, a calculated move to break me completely. And I shouted the first accusation that came to mind. "This is fake. This is just your way of manipulating me, of getting back at him by destroying me." But Damien didn't react with anger or defense. He simply watched me, and the pity in his gaze, a genuine heartbreaking sadness, was more unnerving than any threat, proving to me in that terrible moment that the documents were real, that the entire foundation of my life had been built on a decades-old calculated deception. He waited until my furious outburst subsided, until I was just standing there, shaking, tears finally beginning to track paths through the dust of my composure, before he silently reached into his own coat and produced a second item. A piece of old, brittle parchment. Clearly a handwritten letter folded and refolded so many times that the edges were soft and worn thin. A relic from a life lived long ago. He held it out to me, his hand steady, and I took it, recognizing the elegant, slightly dramatic script. Immediately it was my mother's handwriting, the flowing ink, a painful reminder of her gentle, distant presence, and I unfolded it slowly, reverently, like I was handling a piece of my own fragile past. The letter was dated from the month before I was born, a desperate, frantic missive penned to Damien's father, a final secret confession, and the words detailed the terror of her situation, the iron grip my father had on her, the complete isolation she felt, and the impossible choice she had been forced to make to ensure my survival. I read quickly, my eyes blurring over the text, until I reached the final lines, the ones that had been heavily underlined in the original penmanship, a testament to the weight and finality of her truth. "If anything happens, tell her the truth, she's yours." The world outside the windows, the raging sea, the vast empty sky suddenly tilted off its axis, as I understood the final earth-shattering revelation. I was not Moretti's child, not his possession, but the biological daughter of the man standing before me. Damien Rossi, the vengeful mafia boss, and the sheer unfathomable absurdity of it all. The enemy who had sworn to destroy my father was actually my own father, made me drop the letter and sink onto the chair completely overwhelmed. My perception of Damien changed instantly profoundly, as the lens through which I viewed him shattered. He was no longer just the cruel rescuer or the arrogant enemy, but the man whose DNA ran through my veins, the man whose face was the male counterpart to my own reflection, and the realization was both a comfort and a horrifying burden, shattering the simple narrative of hatred that had sustained me for so long. Elena Moretti, the high-status, untouchable daughter, was dead, replaced by a confused, angry young woman with no name, no past, and a bloodline tainted by the most brutal kind of mafia warfare. And the shame of that mixed parentage of being the product of a love my father had systematically destroyed was almost unbearable, making me feel like a walking, breathing insult to both families. I watched Damien as he came closer, his posture softening slightly, shedding the cold armor of the mob boss to reveal the hesitant, uncertain man underneath. And I realized he wasn't just my father. He was a man who had been unknowingly robbed of his own child, a victim of Moretti's cruelty as much as I was, and that shared sense of violation was the first thing that truly bonded us. Moretti didn't take this revelation quietly. He immediately leveraged his vast network, flooding the underworld with disinformation, using his deep-seated connections in the media and the political sphere to declare Damien a fraud, a desperate man concocting ridiculous lies to justify his terrorist-like attack and his abduction of me. The message was clear and relentless. Damien Rossi was a delusional killer, and the DNA test was a forgery, and I was simply a confused, emotionally unstable girl being used as a tool in a smear campaign against the great Giovanni Moretti. Suddenly, the image of my quiet dignity and polite silence, the carefully maintained persona of the Golden Cage daughter, was shattered and replaced by a far more scandalous, far more humiliating title. I was publicly labeled the sinful half-breed, the product of an illicit affair. A stain on the Moretti name, and the whispers and the mocking laughter followed me even inside the compound, where the guards and the servants now looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt, their loyalty finally shifting to the only name they truly trusted. The fallout was immediate and absolute. My father, in a calculated, cruel move designed to prove to the world that he was in control, publicly declared me persona non grata, barring my return to the main estate, proclaiming that I was an unbearable shame, an insult to his family's honor, sealing my fate as a pariah, a woman with no family, no home, and nowhere left to turn. My name, once whispered with fearful respect, was now a source of open mockery among the Mafia elite. All the entitled, insecure second-generation bosses who had always envied my perceived status now finally had their chance to revel in my fall from grace, and the betrayal of the entire world I had grown up in was agonizingly complete. Damien tried to protect me, using his resources and his influence to counter my father's malicious propaganda, issuing his own statements, sending his own operatives to silence the loudest gossip mongers. But his protection only served to heighten my resentment and my sense of being trapped. I felt like a delicate object caught between two tectonic plates, crushed by the weight of two powerful men fighting over a past I never asked for, over a love story that had resulted in my complete annihilation. The rage finally boiled over one evening when Damien tried to explain the complexities of his decade-long revenge plot, detailing the subtle ways he had worked to undermine Moretti's operations, meticulously outlining the sacrifices he had made, the people he had used, all in the name of reclaiming the life that had been stolen from him. I listened, standing rigidly in the center of the vast, cold living room, watching the sun set over the indifferent sea, and the sheer scale of his calculated destruction. The way he calmly spoke about manipulating lives and destroying empires finally pushed me past the point of silence. I took a sharp step toward him, ignoring the danger driven by a terrible cleansing fury, and I screamed, the sound echoing hollowly off the marble walls. Did you destroy both lives, mine and your own, all just to get revenge on him? Did you have to shatter everything just to prove you were right? The pain in my voice was real raw, reflecting the complete terrifying mess he had made of my existence. And I wanted him to see the human cost of his cold, calculated vengeance, to finally acknowledge that I was more than just a piece of evidence in his long, brutal history. He didn't defend himself, didn't raise his voice, and didn't even flinch at my accusation. He simply looked at me, a long, quiet appraisal, and the silence that followed my outburst was heavy with all the unspoken tragedy between us. Then, in a move that I never could have predicted, a gesture of profound and agonizing surrender, he walked over to a table, picked up a sleek, black semi-automatic pistol, checked the clip with a cold, professional click, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement that held absolutely no fear, he laid it on the desk in front of me, the cold metal catching the last rays of the dying light. "You're right," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I destroyed everything. But I don't want you to be collateral in my war anymore. You deserve a choice." He stepped back a good 10 feet away, spreading his arms slightly, a gesture of complete vulnerability and acceptance. And the sight of him, the most powerful man in the room, offering himself up like a sacrifice, was utterly disarming. "If you want," he challenged me, his eyes dark and steady, his chin slightly raised, exposing the line of his throat in a way that was undeniably human and terrifyingly accessible. "End it now. Stop the cycle. Kill me. One shot." My breath caught in my throat, the audacity of his challenge staggering, and I stared at the gun, the deadly black weapon lying so innocently on the polished wood, suddenly realizing the immense weight of the choice he was offering. Not freedom, not forgiveness, but a final brutal act of agency. My hands were trembling violently, and I reached out my fingers, brushing the cold, unforgiving metal, and the weight of the gun felt impossibly heavy, heavier than any crown or diamond I had ever worn. And I knew in that moment that this was the real test of my character, the moment I had to decide if I was going to be the victim or the executioner, the one who continued the blood feud, or the one who ended it all. I snatched the gun, the instinct taking over the years of suppressed rage and the agony of betrayal finally finding a focus, and I lifted the weapon, the barrel wavering only slightly as I aimed not at his head, not at his heart, but instinctively toward the shoulder that had borne the burden of my rescue a year ago. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the silent room, a sharp, violent crack that marked the end of something and the beginning of something else. And the smell of the burning powder mixed with the sharp scent of his blood immediately filled the air. I watched horrified as a crimson patch instantly blossomed on the dark fabric of his jacket, a line of blood tracing a shallow path down his arm, and I dropped the gun as if it were burning me, unable to look at the damage I had inflicted, unable to believe I had actually pulled the trigger. He only smiled, a genuine, painful curve of the lips that held no malice, only a profound, dark relief. And he didn't even flinch as he pressed a clean handkerchief to the shallow wound, the blood already staining the fine linen. "A clean miss," he murmured, his voice strangely gentle, almost paternal. "Now you have a choice. You know your power. I don't need your forgiveness, Elena. I just need you to be free." The act was a strange, terrible form of baptism. I had shed his blood, but in doing so, I had taken the first step toward releasing myself from the prison of my anger. It was only after that devastating confrontation, when Damien finally put his larger, more immediate plan into motion, that the real meaning of his sacrifice became clear to me. Just 48 hours after I pulled the trigger, while I was still reeling from the psychological whiplash of the entire exchange, the news channels went into a frenzy. Nico Varga, the polished arms dealer I was supposed to marry, had been assassinated in a clean professional hit that made international headlines. The ensuing investigation, which Damien's organization deftly manipulated, quickly revealed that Varga was not just an ally, but an insidious mole, a double agent planted by my father to systematically funnel weapons to a rival faction, an operation that would have crippled Damien's networks and solidified Moretti's dominance for decades. The entire planned marriage was nothing more than an elaborate high-stakes camouflage for the ultimate betrayal, a move so ruthless and cold that even I, Moretti's daughter, felt a chill of disgust run through me. I finally understood the truth. Damien hadn't returned just for personal vengeance. He had come back to dismantle a much larger, more dangerous machine, and in assassinating Varga, he wasn't just settling a score. He was shattering the cycle of violence that my father had meticulously engineered, a cycle that was meant to swallow me whole. The realization brought a rush of complex, confusing emotions relief, that I was no longer bound to Varga, a fresh wave of blinding fury at my father's ultimate depravity, and a strange, powerful surge of respect for Damien. The man who had the strength to look me in the eye, acknowledge his own destruction, and then offer me a loaded gun and a chance at true freedom. The layers of my relationship with him, rescuer, enemy, captive, supposed father protector, were peeling away, leaving behind a raw, painful understanding that defied all logic, and I found myself studying him differently, watching the way he handled his men, the quiet authority in his voice, the way he carried the scar I had given him, a mark of my defiance and his acceptance. The lines between hatred and something else, something terrifyingly close to respect, and yes, even a strange protective love began to blur, pulled apart and rewoven by the constant, overwhelming intensity of our shared bloody destiny, and I could no longer deny the powerful magnetic connection between us. The situation became impossibly more complicated a few weeks later, when an attempted assassination on Damien himself unfolded, a brutal professional ambush that targeted his motorcade. As we were driving through a secluded coastal road, a clear counterattack orchestrated by Moretti in retaliation for Varga's death. The sound of the automatic fire was terrifying, relentless, tearing through the metal like angry hornets, and before my mind could even process the danger, before the security team could fully react, my body moved on instinct, driven by a raw, immediate terror of loss that overwhelmed every shred of reason and self-preservation I possessed. I threw myself across the back seat, physically shoving Damien down, covering his broad, vulnerable chest with my own body, just as a final concentrated burst of gunfire shattered the window where his head had just been resting. I pressed myself against him, breathing in the scent of smoke leather and his unique dark cologne, and the sudden absolute clarity of that moment, the willingness to die for him, was the most terrifying confession I had ever made. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence was ringing, broken only by the urgent commands of the remaining security team, and my own ragged, hysterical gasping, and I remained pinned beneath him, unable to move, unable to speak, the sudden, overwhelming realization of what I had done sinking into my bones. As he pushed himself up, gently rolling me aside, checking me for injury with a rough tenderness that stunned me. My own voice, ragged and full of tears, finally found the sound to articulate the thing I had tried so hard to deny. I can't lose you again. I didn't mean as a father. I meant as the man who saw me, who challenged me, who held the mirror up to my truth, and the sheer raw intensity of that confession hung in the air, heavier than the smoke and the lingering danger witnessed by the stunned faces of his armed guards. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, his eyes dark, deep, and filled with a profound, aching pain that matched the vulnerability I had shown him, and he waited until we were back in the safety of his compound, the physical danger having subsided, but the emotional danger now dangerously heightened. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a thick robe, still shaking, when he finally approached me, his gaze fixed on my face with an expression of heartbreaking finality. "Don't love me?" he ordered, his voice low and firm, a command that felt more like a plea for his own salvation than for mine. "It's a sin. Everything about this is blood, violence, and a lie. You deserve something clean, something uncomplicated, and I am the most complicated, dirtiest thing on this earth. I am not safe for you, Elena." The entire underworld naturally began to buzz with the salacious, irresistible gossip, the ultimate perverse tragedy that was the subject of every hushed conversation. Moretti's daughter is in love with the man who killed her supposed fiancé and destroyed her father's empire. The scandal was magnificent, a truly operatic climax of crime and passion, and the rumors, the open speculation about my unnatural feelings for the man they believed was my biological father, the enemy of my house, were both humiliating and terrifying. solidifying my position as an outcast, a woman corrupted by the very essence of the life I was trying to escape. Damien, sensing the danger of the situation, the terrible moral ambiguity of our bond, made one final desperate attempt to create a line, a boundary that we could not cross away to keep me safe from the condemnation that would surely fall on both of us. He looked at me, his eyes tortured, and he delivered the ultimate statement of separation, the word that both freed me and broke my heart. From now on, Elena, do not call me father. The next few months were characterized by an agonizing push and pull, a constant dance around the edges of a forbidden affection with every stolen glance, every shared late-night conversation, every brush of hands across a desk feeling like a profound betrayal of the natural order and the world's expectations. Damien maintained the physical distance, holding fast to his decree, forcing himself to look at me as a colleague, an associate, an intelligent young woman, anything but the daughter he believed I was, and I in turn respected his boundary, calling him Damien, the name that felt both intimately familiar and dangerously close. It was during this period of strained professional connection that a breakthrough happened, a small, quiet miracle delivered by one of Damien's most diligent operatives, a man who had been tirelessly digging through my father's deepest, most protected archives. He found a piece of old, grainy security footage, a heavily encrypted video file that dated back 26 years, showing an intense clandestine meeting between my mother and a team of my father's most trusted, ruthless lawyers in a hidden room of the old estate. I watched the video sitting beside Damien in his darkened study, both of us leaning in toward the glow of the screen, and the scene that unfolded was agonizingly difficult to witness. My mother, visibly pregnant, pale and shaking, was being coerced, threatened, and ultimately forced to sign a stack of legal documents under the watchful, cold gaze of my father's most calculating lieutenants. The audio was muffled, but the visual was sickeningly clear. She was signing papers to legally and irrefutably acknowledge me as Giovanni Moretti's biological child, creating a paper trail of ownership that was meant to be unbreakable, a lie that would stand up to any future challenge. The operative then explained his findings in a quiet, steady voice. My father hadn't just switched the DNA test a year ago. He had engineered the entire legal and biological narrative from the beginning, creating a flawless legal shell around me that even a legitimate DNA test one Moretti might not even have suspected existed would be forced to acknowledge. He then presented a final stunning piece of evidence, the original sealed DNA test my mother had conducted immediately after my birth, hidden in a secure Swiss vault. A test that confirmed her parentage, but also proved scientifically, and without any room for doubt, that the man I had shot, the man I had fallen in love with, the man who had been tormented for 12 years believing he was my father, was not in fact biologically related to me at all. The entire world we had built, the shared pain, the forbidden love, the guilt, the shame, and the moral agony of our connection, all of it had been constructed on the single massive lie orchestrated by my father 26 years ago. The relief that washed over me was so overwhelming that it was almost painful, a sudden blinding light that exorcised years of confusion and guilt, leaving behind a profound, glorious freedom. But when I looked at Damien, he had simply collapsed forward onto his hands, his head bowed, his entire massive frame shaking with a silent, agonizing realization. 12 years, he whispered, the sound raw and broken, muffled against his folded arms. I lived 12 years thinking I had lost a child and was raising myself up to be the man who would destroy that child's only protector. All that hate, all that pain, all the destruction, based on a single lie. He didn't look at me, couldn't look at me, the weight of his misplaced guilt and the wasted decades of vengeance crushing him entirely. The powerful Mafia boss finally completely shattered by the simplicity of the truth. I walked to him slowly, gently, and I placed my hand on his broad shoulder, feeling the linen of his shirt beneath my palm, watching as the single drop of blood from my bullet wound a few weeks prior suddenly felt like the most profound and ironic coincidence in the history of the world. I smiled through my tears, a genuine, joyful, completely unburdened smile, and I spoke the words that finally freed both of us, severing the last dark chain of our false bloodline. Then I have the right to choose my love. You are not my father. You are just my destiny. He lifted his head, then his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a mixture of shock wonder and a cautious dawning hope that was beautiful and terrifying to behold. And he stared at me, truly seeing me for the first time, not as a daughter, not as a victim, not as collateral, but as the woman who loved him, the woman who had just defied the universe for him. He reached up his hand, cupping my cheek, his touch impossibly tender and reverent, and he let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound that felt like it had been trapped in his chest for decades. His eyes shone with a terrible, fierce determination, the same look I had seen in that damp shack by the sea a year ago. Only now the promise was no longer a curse, but a solemn vow of possession rooted in pure, unadulterated devotion, and he choked out the words, "Then I'll come back for what's truly mine." The mine was no longer revenge, no longer a debt, no longer an asset. It was me. It was our future. It was the love that had survived a lifetime of lies and destruction, and the sheer power of his claim made me tremble with anticipation. My father, Giovanni Moretti, still reeling from the public execution of Varga and the unrelenting pressure from Damien's networks, finally made his last desperate and predictably brutal move. He found a way to reach me a flaw in the extensive security, and he abducted me not quietly, but with a chaotic, violent flourish, dragging me away from the compound in the dead of night. He didn't take me to a place of power or safety. He drove me to an abandoned industrial shipyard, a massive, echoing factory floor filled with rusting machinery and shadows, and he chained me deliberately and maliciously to a massive steel column directly adjacent to a ticking digital timer, a makeshift bomb that he had armed and set to detonate. His final act of hatred was not just to kill me, but to use me as a bait, a piece of final heartbreaking vengeance against the one man he knew he couldn't defeat. And he spoke to Damien through a crackling low-frequency radio, his voice twisted with manic triumph. "I will die today, Rossi, but I will take with me the one thing you finally admitted you love. You can watch her disappear in the fire you created." I was terrified, shaking uncontrollably, watching the red numbers on the timer count down to single digits, the smell of dust, rust, and explosives heavy and metallic in the cold air, and I knew with absolute certainty that if Damien rushed in, if he tried to be the hero, the bomb would kill both of us, leaving my father the perverse satisfaction of a mutual destruction. Through the tears that streamed down my face, I grabbed the radio, my voice hoarse and raw with a final desperate plea that wasn't for my own life, but for his chance at freedom. His chance to rebuild the life that my family had stolen from him. "If you ever loved me, Damien, don't come." I screamed the command into the static, knowing that if I let him save me, he would only complete my father's ultimate goal, that the only way to truly defeat Moretti's hatred was to deny him the pleasure of Damien's sacrifice. I dropped the radio, closed my eyes, and waited for the end, praying that he would hear my final command, that he would choose life over my death, and that he would finally break the chain of his loyalty to me. I heard the sirens first, the distant wail of the authorities that Damien had clearly called in the sign that he was putting the welfare of his future over my immediate salvation, and the sound brought a strange, detached peace, a sense of having finally found the strength to make the ultimate selfless choice. But then, cutting through the wail of the sirens and the frantic tick of the timer, I heard the single, unmistakable sound of a heavy metal door being kicked open with a violent, terrifying crash, and I opened my eyes just in time to see his silhouette fill the doorway, Damien rushing toward me, moving with a speed and a certainty that was absolute, a man who had chosen love and destiny over survival. He reached me, didn't hesitate, didn't try to cut the chain, just grabbed me, shielding my head with his body, throwing us both down onto the dusty, cold concrete floor as the timer hit 0, and the final deafening explosion ripped through the factory, turning the world into a blinding, searing wave of heat sound and the sharp, choking smell of smoke and concrete dust. The fire and the smoke claimed everything that night, consuming my father's final desperate act of violence. and the official report read like an inevitable conclusion to a life lived by the sword. Giovanni Moretti was lost in the conflagration, his empire destroyed, not by a single bullet, but by the relentless, all-consuming fire he had lit with his own hatred. The world he had created, the world built on lies, betrayal, and the stolen love between two people was finally reduced to ashes, and rumors collapsing under the weight of its own corruption, leaving behind only the cold, stark truth. It took 6 months for the dust to settle, 6 months for the legal teams, the political maneuverings, and the sheer force of Damien's remaining will to stabilize the fractured remnants of the criminal territories. And during that time, I realized I had to step up to fill the void, not as a symbol of my father's pride, but as the legitimate, clear-eyed owner of the chaos. I took the helm of what was left of the Moretti holdings, consolidating, rebuilding, and cleaning house, with a quiet, efficient ruthlessness. I never knew I possessed surprising everyone who had ever dismissed me as the soft, beautiful pawn, and the media quickly and predictably dubbed me La Signora Rossi, an acknowledgement of the clear, unmistakable influence of the man who had been my protector and my destiny. One night, a rainy night just as cold and still as the one I had met him on a 1.5 years prior, I was sitting alone in the main study of the restored estate, running my new empire with a pen and a clear conscience, when I heard a hesitant, familiar sound, a quiet, steady knock on the heavy oak door. I looked up, knowing before I even saw him that it was finally time, and I watched as the door opened, revealing Damien standing in the shadows, his presence still commanding, still dangerous, but softened by the clear, deep burn scars that traced a dark, permanent map across one side of his face and neck, a testament to the cost of his love. He was wearing a simple black coat, looking utterly exhausted and impossibly beautiful. A man who had walked through the literal fire and returned finally free of the debt he had carried for 12 years, and he looked at me standing straight, a warrior offering his final surrender. "I came back," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur heavy with rain and relief, "for what's mine." I stood up, pushing my chair back with a soft scrape against the wood floor, walking toward him without hesitation, shedding the armor of the boss for the vulnerability of the woman who had waited, and I saw the flicker of pain and desire in his eyes, the deep, dark longing that mirrored my own. I reached up and gently placed my hand against the scar on his cheek, acknowledging the mark of our shared salvation, and I answered him, my voice steady, unbroken, completely honest without a single tear. "Then take it, because I'm yours too." We kissed then, standing in the doorway between the rain and the light, two survivors of a war. Neither of us had started two souls who had found redemption in the heart of the destruction, finally ready to build something true from the ashes. The world had tried to tell me I was small, that my worth was defined by my father's name, or a piece of paper. It tried to tell me I was collateral, a pawn, a sinful half-breed unworthy of respect or love. But I walked through the fire, and I came out the one in charge. The truth I learned is that your strength isn't in how loud you scream, or how much you fight, but in how quietly you hold on to your dignity when the world is burning down around you. And sometimes the greatest love story is the one that survives all the lies and chooses to forgive the blood. You were never small, friend. You were just waiting for your moment. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.